Good morning. Can I welcome everyone to the 8th meeting of the Justice Committee in 2016, and can ask everyone to switch off mobile phones and other electronic devices as the interview is broadcasting, even when they're put in silent. No apologies have been received. Turn to item 1, Police Scotland. It's the first item today, and it's an evidence session of Police Scotland's internal communications and on its policies and procedures in relation to the protection of staff who report wrongdoing of malpractice within the organisation. That's the topic. That's the subject for today. The session is intended to build on the committee's recent evidence gathering on the interception of communications, while moving the debate onto related matters of public interest concerning the work of Police Scotland. And can I welcome to the meeting for the very first time, and possibly the last time in this session, no, you're coming for the subcommittee on policing, so it's a penultimate appearance of Chief Constable Philip Gormley and Andrew Flanagan, Chair of the SPA. You've been here before, and John Foley, the SPA's Chief Executive. You've been under long-term service with us, I think, seen you many times. When questions are asked by a member directly to you, your microphone will come on automatically. Otherwise, if you indicate to me you wish to respond, I'll call you and you know, your light will come on, so you don't need to bother pressing anything. Right, straight to questions, please. I've got Christian, followed by Margaret.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning.
Gil.
Good morning to the panel and good morning. I just wanted to have some clarification. I cannot understand why, for the life of me, we haven't got a whistle-blowing policy, but instead we have decided to write it differently than other organisations who really specify by whistle-blowing policy should be about whistleblowing and not being about disclosure, for example.
Right, so let's take that on.
I'm happy to do that. I mean, thank you. We've got a range of what are called standard operating procedures, and in preparation for this, clearly I've had a look at them. I can list them. They all deal with support to staff in a range of circumstances, including when they're raising issues of concern or conscience. And they're all fit for purpose.
What is the list, please?
Would you like me to read it, Convener? I can. It's about 12 or so SOPs.
You want to hear the list?
I will be happy to.
You want to hear the list?
The list is, we have policy, standard operating procedures around attendance management, business interest, complaints about the police, a disciplinary standing operating procedure, equality, diversity and dignity, equality impact assessment, gifts, gratuities, hospitality and sponsorship, grievances, notifiable associations, Police Service of Scotland conduct regulations, stress management, suspension from duty, transgender people in employment and trauma risk management. So we've got a range of SOPs that touch on or support staff officers who have issues either in terms of their own personal position or issues of cause of concern. What I have done in terms of looking at this is think through, whilst those in themselves are perfectly respectable and I think fit for purpose in a large part, do they add up in totality to a position where we are developing a culture that enables staff to step forward with confidence? And what I've asked and commissioned is a review really that looks at and understands the culture within the service and the key issues and dilemmas faced by staff, looks outside of our organisation at best practice, whether that's international, in the business world, law enforcement or third sector. What I found, particularly in the National Crime Agency, and I think there are clear parallels here, is we are asking staff to operate in an increasingly complex environment. Some of the threats that they are now being asked to deal with take them into slightly different spaces, particularly around privacy and issues of conscience and concern. And what I want is, in fairly quick time, to understand whether there's some learning that we can incorporate into our approach. So, you know, there are other police services. The most obvious ones to look at would probably be the Metropolitan Police in London, because there's a similarity of scale and complexity. Police service in Northern Ireland are working in a very complicated environment. And actually, post-Snowden, there are issues around, as we ask staff to work in difficult and sensitive environments, how do they ventilate their views? How do they make us aware? And the final piece for me is around there must be some learning, for instance, from the health service. You know, if you look at the sort of issues that they have confronted around staff being able to make known their views, their concerns around policy, practice, procedures, then I think we can probably look at that, because where I want to get to is not just a list of what are very sensible standard operating procedures, but does it add up to an approach which develops a culture where staff are prepared to come forward and feel supported and confident in doing so. Where does that lead us to? Well, I'll wait to see what comes back, but I want us to be best in class around developing that culture. And I don't rule out, developing an ethics committee within the organisation, ethics counsellors. There are other approaches elsewhere, where as we move into this more complicated world, I think it's not simply about distinct SOPs which deal with specific issues. They are part of it. It is, what is that overarching culture in the organisation? Does it add up to the sort of environment where staff have that ability to speak up with confidence? And what can we learn from elsewhere?
Christian.
One thing we could have learned from elsewhere is, first of all, to answer the question, and second of all, maybe to answer the question about whistleblowing. I knew all your answer, and thanks very much for your comprehensive answer. I didn't hear the word whistleblowing, and I kind of don't understand why an organisation who will want to encourage whistleblowing are not using the word whistleblowing in its language.
Well, I'm very happy to use the word whistleblowing. There are some issues around that as a term. Some people take exception to that as a description. I think the real issue here, for me, is about how do we enable staff who have issues of conscience or concern around law, practice or procedure to raise those in the organisation. Because as the Chief Constable, I want to understand that. I want to know whether there are unintended consequences of the approaches we are taking around issues. There may be issues around how performance management is implemented at a middle or a more junior level of management. If staff feel under pressure or are not clear about what is being expected of them or have issues, I want to hear about it. So what I'm saying is I want to launch, I am commissioning a comprehensive piece of work to look outside of the organisation and how do we support staff who want to raise issues of concern, whistleblowing to use the vernacular. But what do we then do with that information? How do we develop our service? How do we develop the sort of internal culture which is about continuous improvement? There are some really good pieces of practice in Police Scotland. We've been recognised by Stonewall as in the top 100 employees in terms of our responses to people with transgender, transsexual, gay issues. There are some really good pieces of work within our organisation. What I want us to be is best in class. And all of those SOPs that I've outlined provide elements of support. My question to the organisation, and therefore myself, is do they add up in totality to the sort of position I think we need to adopt? And I want to look externally around what is the best possible, to use your phrase, whistleblowing policy. But it's not just about the policy. It's about how we then use the information coming back from staff, how we hear their voice, how we reflect on the ethical dilemmas, the legal challenges that they are confronting, to make sure that we provide the best possible service we can to the public.
Let me put it to the SPA, it's about encouraging whistleblowing, and we heard from the Chief Constable, talking about what's happening afterwards once people have made the commitment to be whistleblower. But other SPs got any views on how the policy should concentrate on encouraging whistleblowing?
I think the authority conducted an internal audit of whistleblowing policies in the first half of 2015. And I think there were 3 issues that came out of that I think need to be further looked at. One is the policy itself. Within the police service, it is referred to as integrity matters. To all intents and purposes, the audit found that this is a whistleblowing policy by any other name. And there has been some resistance from Police Scotland in terms of using that phrase, whistleblowing, and the Chief Constable can comment on that. But to all intents and purposes, if you put whistleblowing at the top and you read it, you would see it was a normal policy that you would see in most walks of life. I think the 3 issues, excuse me, one is it's more narrowly drawn into professional standards and criminal acts than you would normally expect in a more general whistleblowing policy. I think the second thing, there were some issues about how it's been communicated and rolled out, and the usage of it as a policy, and I think it could be better embedded. And in fact, we saw within the staff survey issues about communication, internal communication with staff, and I think that could be improved on. So as a small example, there's many posters. If you walk into any police office, you will see the Integrity Matters posters up on the wall, so encouraging people to do it, but they don't have the phone number on it. You know, as a simple thing, that shouldn't happen. The third area, I think, where there is a weakness is that it doesn't actually deal with complaints or whistleblowing that might arise as a result of the work of professional standards or the counter-corruption unit. It's unclear, it's not specified as to if you have a complaint against the people who in themselves would conduct the investigations, how do you report that? The only alternative to going through the channels that are specified is to go to your staff association or to Crime Stoppers. And I think potentially the SPA should have an identifiable role within that in terms of complaints of that nature or whistleblowing of that nature.
So that's the policy, but can you tell us the number of, whatever we want to call it, whistleblower, or the number of disclosures that have occurred since the inception of Police Scotland?
I don't have that information.
I'm not sure I can answer that specific question in terms of the total numbers since Police Scotland, but what I can say in response to the points made by the Chairman around Integrity Matters, which was introduced in March last year and superseded a position called Safe Call, as I understand it. There have been 133 referrals into Integrity Matters from members of staff.
Explain to me, Integrity Matters, these referrals, what were they about?
Well,
get some examples.
Well, I don't have precise examples, but the broad sense of them, there were 29 around issues around potential criminality and 104 more general ones.
And they were all of whistle-blowing type?
Well, they were all...
Or general comments?
Well, I haven't reviewed all 133 of them, as I'm sure you would understand, but actually they are issues that staff have felt that they wanted to bring to the attention of the organisation. I say 104 are general concerns or non-criminal concerns, and 29 are criminal. Some of those referrals have led to misconduct proceedings, and some have led to reports going to the Crown. So there's a broad mixture in there of serious and not so serious issues.
Have you got some feedback on how the people who've done that whistleblowing are being protected after they made the disclosure?
I've got no direct evidence of that. I mean, what I clearly have is a relationship with the unions and the police staff associations. There have been no concerns brought to my notice in the last 2 months in terms of the issues around how people have felt supported. But that is the broader point I'm making at the start, is we've got some good initiatives, some good SOPs, Integrity Matters and the others that I went through with you. What I need to understand is, as we go forward, how do we make sure that we've got the best possible position in this organisation to support staff, to enable them to come forward? There's a range of routes through that. There are line managers, there is Integrity Matters, there is staff associations, there are the unions, there is third-party reporting, and part of the issue around Integrity Matters taking it forward is building on some of the issues that the chairman has made in terms of does it deal with the totality of concerns? I need to reassure myself that we are in that position. Can we introduce a third-party element to it? So that may or may not involve the police authority or a third party who staff, if they really are in a position where they don't trust the organisation to the extent that they really don't feel they can connect with the organisation around these matters, that they do connect elsewhere, and we are able to respond to those issues. Because that's the organisation I want to lead, where staff feel engaged, they feel supported, they're confident coming forward, and that it's fair both to the individuals and also the individuals about whom issues are being raised, or systems and processes where we are not potentially getting it right.
Thank you very much for
I'm going to let somebody else come in, Christian, and you can come back to you, because you've had quite a whack. I think the introduction of third parties is interesting, because I think many of us on this committee, and no doubt members who are not in the committee, will have in our inboxes messages from officers who feel that if they open their mouth, they're victimised. They either have opened their mouth and they think and they're alleging they've been victimised, or they won't do it because they think they'll get victimised within the organisation. I'm sure you'll be aware of this. How far down the road of this idea of a third party to make people feel secure? After all, if you say something, you might not get promoted, things will happen in the office, you get moved, things like this. Subtle, none, and not so subtle.
Well, and I agree, and it's difficult to deal with anecdote around this. You know, there will be staff who feel like that. There will be other individuals who clearly have issues because they're potentially being managed in a way that they don't think is appropriate, but we may do so. So there's a broad range within that. Sorry, could you just repeat the first question?
It was back to your third party,
yeah.
back to something external from the police. You've listed a whole list of
yes,
things. But, I mean, they're there, but I suspect there'll be officers out there who say, so be it, but I wouldn't. Well, I'm not going to say anything because I've seen what happens to somebody else. Now, whether it's true or not, it's there. And I'm sure we've had this in our inboxes. Other members of the committee have had briefings, as it were, and stories from serving officers who are not happy, who won't say anything because they feel there'll be some comeback for them. Either they don't get promoted or, in fact, they'll find themselves at the end of some complaint aimed at them. You know, so this can happen in our big organisations. I'm asking about your third party, which is an interesting thing you're looking at.
I mean, what I'm saying is that's an area that I want to look at. What I'm saying is that, you know, in the 8 weeks I've been here, I've seen some good practice. I've seen some areas where I think we need to reassure ourselves that we are in the best possible position as an organisation. We should aspire, and I do, to be the leading police service in the UK. And that involves making sure staff are confident and feel supported. You know, whether it's a reality or their perception, if members of staff are feeling like that with justification, then there's a real issue. And I recognise that, which is why I've said what I've said, is that I'm not trying to present that this organisation is in the perfect place. I think, you know, this is the 6th police force or law enforcement agency I've worked in, some of whom have gone through enormous amounts of upheaval and change. That does cause issues for staff. But we need to make sure that we develop the best possible response, and that's what I'm hoping to do.
Margaret, sorry.
Yes, there's still an issue of whistleblowing, and to tease out this unease with the term, because it is a term that resonates with the public, and they do tend to think that it ensures transparency in an organisation. And my understanding is it's sometimes referred to as making a disclosure, blowing the whistle, and that to be covered by whistleblowing law, a worker who makes a disclosure or whistleblows must believe 2 things. One, that they're acting in the public interest, and secondly, that the worker must reasonably believe the disclosure tends to show past, present, or likely future wrongdoing. And then there's various categories. If we were to establish that as the grounds for the term whistleblowing, could we accept that we're quite happy with the term and it can be used?
I wouldn't want to overstate this at all, Convener. There is just, all I'm aware of is there are a range of views around the term whistleblowing. It doesn't offend me, but it has some people would say it has some pejorative context around it. The real issue here is the ones that you've made, is that making sure that staff who feel that way are able to exercise their voice, to be heard, to feel safe, to feel secure, and to be confident the organisation, when it's appropriate, will act on that. And that's what I want to be in a position to do.
Yeah. If I could now turn to the SPA Audit and Risk Committee and the SPA's review.
Before you get to that, you go back to whistleblowing. That was about OK Gill. Is it still on that?
It's all whistleblowing, because I took a particular interest in this in 2014, having had a complaint from an officer during the Commonwealth Games who was very reluctant to express his concerns. Now, at that time, I wrote to the Cabinet Secretary and got some very useful information. It was the former Cabinet Secretary. So I was somewhat surprised that we're now saying that we didn't really have a policy in whistleblowing, when he told me that it's been in place. I think Safe Call Limited was mentioned today, and he was certainly of the opinion that that was a function or a process in place where police officers could raise their concerns. That was followed up with an FOI from my office, And I can tell you today, and I'm surprised it hasn't come out in the review from SPA, that in October 2000, that in 2013 there were 15 referrals to Police Scotland through that. It's run in the northeast of England, but the ones referring to Police Scotland, that affected Police Scotland in 2015 were 15 referrals. 12 of these cases were concluded. And in 2014 there were 18 referrals with 10 cases concluded. So it rather begs the question, if we are now looking at 133, that's a good news story. And I'd rather like to know why SPA hadn't gone back in its review and done something as elementary as look at the actual data, saying where are we now and where will we progress to?
Mr Foley looks as if he wants to respond to that.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Yes, indeed, your figures are correct. At that time, Police Scotland did operate the system which was known as Safe Call, which was whistleblowing effectively. The numbers were low, as you suggest, and the reason for the review of Safe Call and the implementation of Integrity Matters was to improve the opportunities that people had to make referrals through Integrity Matters, so to encourage people to actually make more contact over issues that presented themselves within Police Scotland, and that's what happened. The Integrity Matters papers were presented and discussed at the SPA board and certainly at the Audit and Risk Committee. That's been at Audit and Risk Committee on a number of occasions, and again most recently as January of this year. And Police Scotland took away some actions to review some elements of it and come back again to Audit and Risk.
Mr Foley? The point I'm making is, I have the figures here. You've been asked for them just a few minutes ago and you seemed unable to produce them.
I didn't have the exact figures with me, but the numbers, when you say them, are broadly in line with my recollection of what the numbers were.
It would have been helpful if in replying to that answer you had said, I don't have them with me, but I certainly do have. Now, this is an important point,
yes,
Convener.
I think you need to reprimand him, though. I think the point is made.
I think it's an important point. Please,
just a moment, just a moment. I think the point is made. But you've made a good point. Let's go on.
Well, if we're getting a good analysis of where Police Scotland is falling down and where it's improving, I think it's important we come to committee with that information for the committee to make these decisions. Can I also ask just, perhaps for Mr Gormley, how decisions and policy which affect personal operation policing are communicated to staff?
Now, this is communications now. So
This is on operational policy.
Yes, but I want to go back, just keep back at whistle, because I've got a couple of people want to come in on whistleblowing.
Right.
Before you, I've got Gil, then I've got Rod. Then we'll move on to communications.
Yeah, thanks very much. A couple of my colleagues have asked most of the questions I wanted to ask in the first place. But I would suggest to the panel that we all know what whistleblowing means, and it would be a good idea, you know, in your review, and I very much welcome that. I think it's a good idea that we actually use the term, because everybody in public life, we know exactly what it means, and then we can refer to it in that way. But I wondered if you know, on the question that Margaret Mitchell asked, I wonder if you have these figures that you could, maybe not at the present time, if you could provide these figures, it would give us a good steer, put some flesh in the bones to know what we're talking about. And at the same time, it's always good, it's good to know if progress has been made. And I wonder if, and I'm sure you don't have these figures in any case at this time, but I wonder if there's any historical figures in relation to what happened in the previous model of the 8 boards that we had in place. If you had these figures so that we could compare, is things getting better or is it just the same as before?
We'll provide the figures that we've got so that there are exact numbers for the record. Going back beyond the creation of Police Scotland, in any data that we've been looking at has been challenging in terms of getting numbers from the original 8 legacy forces. So we will attempt to do that and see if there is some trend information that we can get. But as I say, that's proved challenging on previous occasions. I think it is encouraging that we're seeing a greater number of referrals. I have to say, though, that out of a workforce of 22,000, 130, I'm not sure necessarily reflects success. I think that we should be seeing and encouraging more response through the whistleblowing lines, rather than, if we get to a situation where we have a large number that perhaps are not worthy of pursuing because they're the wrong ones. Sometimes you find that, for example, whistleblowing lines can be used for HR grievances rather than necessarily for what they're intended. But we should be actually seeing a higher number of disclosures through this, and then being able to work that through and monitoring the trends. So as I say, it's encouraging that it's gone up, but I'm still rather cautious that 130 out of that size of a workforce is what we should be seeing.
I think it's 133 for that period. What would be useful in writing to the committee would be to tell us the breakdown. I think I've taken a note 29 related to criminality, and the others whereof you said a general nature. It's quite useful in knowing what the grievances are that are referred, if you could do that. Obviously it would be anonymised, but the data would be useful, and I think the committee would appreciate that. I'm looking around for some support, but then I'm not getting any. Yes, I am. That's good. Roddy.
Thank you, Convener. My point is just a small point of detail too. Police Scotland incepted 1st of April 2013. From what I've heard, I presume that Safe Call was still going on. It would be useful to know when Safe Call ended and integrity matters started. I haven't heard that this morning. Can you answer that?
I think I can. I mean, again, I wasn't here, but the briefing I've been given is that predecessor Safe Call was replaced by Integrity Matters, which is effectively the whistleblowing policy and process on the 2nd of March 2015. 2nd of March 2015. So just under a year, and as has already been alluded to, since that point, 133 in total, 29 in some form of criminality and 104 more general. But absolutely, I'd be prepared to provide a more more detailed breakdown of the sorts of issues that are being raised, because those are the sorts of issues I'm interested in, actually, because this is about organisational learning and development and us understanding what is concerning officers, how they're making their voices heard, and how we respond when appropriate.
Thank you.
Yes, if I could ask Mr Gormley about how decisions on policy which affect operational policing are communicated to staff.
Certainly. I mean, I've got a flowchart which I can take people through. Forgive me. What I would say is a lot of it would depend on the complexity of the issue. So, if it was a major legislative change that required the whole of the workforce to be reskilled or retrained, and there are examples of that, then clearly it's a very different process from a more discrete change in guidance, where we've got a much more limited impact on staff. So there's a broad range from a very discrete change of policy or procedure around perhaps a very technical element of policing, through to a very generic requirement to retrain officers in a fundamental change in a legal process. But in essence, we will be notified of a proposal around either updated legislation or guidance. That would then be considered by the Strategic Leadership Board, Senior Leadership Board, which is myself and senior chief officers. And we would then identify an individual who would respond to that, and it would normally be relevant to their portfolio responsibilities. So, as we presently sit here, if it was fundamentally going to affect officers in local policing, that would go to Rose Fitzpatrick. If it was in the crime area, it would go to Ian and Livingston. And what they would be responsible for then is identifying what are the organisational implications. Who do we need to engage with internally and externally to understand the impact of this? So, if we were going to change our response investigatively or in a procedural way, it may have knock-on implications for other agencies and stakeholders. That could be the Crown, it could be victim support, it could be the third sector. There are a range of people that we would need to understand what is the impact of our proposed response to that change in guidance. And also to offer some advice, actually. I've been involved historically around a lot of mental health issues, where we develop training and guidance for staff in terms of how to respond to people in crisis. Actually, we're not mental health professionals. There are mental health professionals, again, both third sector and statutory, helping us develop procedure and policy and responses to people in crisis. From that, we will then develop guidance and training material. And again, I go back to the point, it depends how many people that would affect, and it also would depend on the type of change. If it was a very narrow group of individuals, that could probably be done on face-to-face briefings. If it's a fairly transactional piece of legislation that doesn't require a fundamental response, there are approaches around e-learning and distance learning that may or may not be appropriate. We set up intranet mini-sites to allow officers to train themselves around this, but a lot of it depends on what the issue is. and the issuance then of force memoranda, standard operating procedures and internal guidance.
Let's take a big issue. We go back to the issue of armed police and the issue also of stop and search, which were raised, and which then instructions were given out to officers about how to behave in those circumstances, what to do and what not to do. But some of them still did it because apparently the communications didn't get through. Now, we're not just talking about small things, not really big issues, which were causing Police Scotland a lot of trouble. So, you know, that's the question that we're really asking about, because one of the issues we had from the representatives of the officers, it was that there's so much that comes through in emails, such a plethora of information that lost in amongst all this are serious, important bits of communication. Now, how are you addressing that? Because busy officers don't have time to read every email that comes through from HQ.
No, and I don't expect some of these issues to be dealt with by email from headquarters, genuinely. You know, I think we need to recognise where we've come from and where we need to get to. The amount of work required in the first 3 years, the early stages of Police Scotland, to bring together an enormous range of approaches, policy, procedure,
We've lived
practice.
that. We've lived that with Police Scotland for the past 3 years. So I'm just getting at, these are the big issues about communication that my colleague's asking about. Margaret, yes.
If I could give an example, and it was Police Scotland's Crime and Justice Division policy to issue on-the-spot warnings for the possession of cannabis rather than reporting to the Crown and Procurator Fiscal Service. Now, this was obviously before you were in place, but when I visited local commanders, it was clear they weren't aware of the policy, and worse still, they were just embarking on an operation to crack down on drugs. Clearly a huge disconnect.
Well, and I'm not for one moment challenging that as a description of what happened. I simply don't know. But that's not where we need to be. And one of the issues that I think is significant for us going forward is understanding how national policy decisions impact locally. And as I've gone around the country talking to staff and officers and local authority, civic leaders, this is one of the issues, not specifically around training that's coming out, but around us being able to hear local views about the impact of national decisions.
Can I stop you there? This was a decision by Police Scotland's Criminal Justice Division, and when I queried it with some of the senior management, they said the real motivation for this was the Crown Procurator Fiscal Service were just so overwhelmed. It was faster to do this.
Well, I genuinely can't comment on that. I'm happy to go up. The point I was perhaps clumsily making was in response to the convener's issue around communication and national decisions around things like stop search, arming of officers and how they're deployed. Our ability to understand how that lands locally, its impact on some very diverse communities, because what people would regard as normal and acceptable in Glasgow and Edinburgh will be different in the Highlands and Islands, and that's been made very clear to me. That's
national
my point.
Things. These were not local.
No, that's my point. But it was a national decision in terms of the arming of officers in Scotland. The position.
It wasn't the arming. It was the being in public places.
Yes. Yeah,
and
that's
then
the point.
and there was a big stooshy, which I'm sure you're aware of. And then Police Scotland said this had been remedied. Everybody knew where they were, but they didn't. And that's a big issue that should have been something that all officers were aware of, including the issues of stop and search, the so-called voluntary stop and search. But we still had it happening, despite a couple of colleagues here, having a good go at it for a very long time. And it's to do with communications. We're back to this.
I think we're probably violently agreeing.
So it's nothing to do with local issues, like whether it's happening in the grass market
I think the broader point around communications is, and the point I'm attempting to make not very well, is that for us to understand how, when we make national decisions around national functions, we understand how that will affect local communities who have a very different demand from policing. So the culture and practice and relevance of a policing approach in Glasgow will be very different from Highlands and Islands.
Let me stop you there. I perfectly understand the difference between Arami in the grass market and Arami in a wee village, and what people would expect maybe in the grass market at 2 o'clock on a Sunday morning after the various clubs. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about go back to the issue of armed police being in the supermarket or whatever out in public, and also stop and search. That issue of the policy and the way it was used, wherever you were, was to be sorted. There's nothing about tweaking it for different areas. And that did not get through to officers, certain officers on the beat. That's the bit about communicating. It's not that. We understand that stuff about different policing cultures in different areas.
Okay.
So is that, these are the issues about communicating. Is that sorted now? Is that ever, you know, a big decision like that? Is it sorted so that we don't have it happening again?
Well, I would be foolish to sit here and give a 100% guarantee, because in organisational life, with 3,000 people, and the complexity of what we deal with, will we make mistakes in the future? I suspect we probably will. Is our ambition to make sure that when we're introducing new pieces of legislation or significant changes of working practice, that we've got a thought-through process that ensures that we identify a lead for this, we identify the right means of communication, we ensure staff have the right guidance and training and understand what they're going to do. Yes, we do have a policy and process in relation to that.
I hope the examples we've given have been helpful,
They have.
and you know, I know that you'll go back and look at them and see where communication could be improved.
Thank you.
I mean, some of the problems that have happened for Police Scotland, frankly, were of their own making. I have to say, it's historic now with you there, but they were of their own making, and that's what we're asking to be addressed so that it doesn't happen again. I've now got Elaine, please.
Yes, thank you, and welcome to the new Chief Constable. Maybe wishes he hadn't taken the job by now.
I'm very pleased I did.
I want to look a little bit around...
Those we're running out of time of leaving another few
I know that the HMSCIS is conducting an inquiry into the breach of the Acquisition and Disclosure of Communications Data Code of Practice. Yeah. But we've been told that that actually was due to an oversight, which meant that the changes in the code didn't get to the single point of contact in the counter-corruption unit. Have you been appraised as why this is, and are you confident that there are procedures in place now to make sure that this type of thing doesn't either in specific to this particular type of information or indeed other important decisions, that this type of oversight won't happen again?
Yes, I am. I mean, I've been briefed on the circumstances around that breach. You've clearly heard evidence from ACC Nicholson and before him DCC Richardson, where we accept absolutely that mistakes and oversights were made. In terms of that specific set of issues, there's an action plan. We've responded to the recommendations emanating from the learning in that, and I am confident around that set of issues that we are in a place where that will not be repeated. The HMICS will report back, I think, in the spring, is their timeline. Clearly, we'll reflect very carefully on those recommendations, and I will take those forward.
We were advised that one officer did actually raise some concerns about the application, but somehow their concerns weren't taken forward. And again, can we be confident in future that if an officer does raise concerns about a particular issue, that the channels of communication are such that their concerns are taken seriously?
Well, my ambition is exactly that. I mean, clearly we've got two processes in train at the moment. One is the HMICS review, which will look at the circumstances of this case and come back with some observations and recommendations which we as an organisation will clearly take seriously and act on. We've got an IPT, an Investigatory Powers Tribunal, which clearly is a judicial, quasi-judicial process. Again, there'll be some judgments out of the back of that. At the end of that, I don't rule anything in or anything out in terms of what we then subsequently need to do as an organisation. There are actions that have been taken, a robust action plan that's been commented on favourably by IOCO in terms of our response to that set of circumstances. We've then got a broader review by the HMICS into the counter-corruption unit and the circumstances that led to this apparent breakdown of communication, stroke misinterpretation, stroke mistakes. We've got an IPT which will come to a conclusion, and at the end of that will be lessons to be learnt maybe on an individual and on an organisational basis, and you have my absolute commitment that we'll respond to that.
Yes, because we were, as conveners reminding, we were advised that it had been reckless, so obviously we wouldn't want to see... Yes.
That's the determination by the IPC.
So it wasn't just mistakes, it was reckless.
Well, I'm not disputing for one moment what IOCO said. Not for one moment.
Obviously, this is something I would imagine a future Justice Committee will not survive much longer, but I'm sure a future Justice Committee will be interested in returning to some of these issues once the reports have been published. You may be aware, I don't know whether the Scottish Police Federation has contacted you directly, but they have raised with the committee concerns about aspects of the counter-corruption unit and in particular, with let's say they are aware of members being ordered or invited to interviews which have a status that appears to sit outside criminal procedure or misconduct investigation. Has SPF raised any of these concerns directly, either with yourself as Chief Constable or with the SPA?
Yes, Mr. Flanagan.
Yes, the SPF has raised those concerns with us, and it is a focal point of the HMICS investigation and review. And just to clarify in terms of your earlier question, HMI is looking at the broader aspects of counter-corruption rather than the issues that IOCO raised, because that's IOCO's role in terms of that. There is a linkage between the two in terms of the overall operation of the unit and how those things may come up. So there may be lessons to be learned around the IOCO issues that come out of the HMICS report, but actually their work is more focused on what the issues that the SPF have raised with us.
That's interesting, actually, yes, because we get the impression, really, that they're a sort of a standalone policing unit which is developing its own particular culture.
A wee bit of a law
you know,
unto themselves, in fact.
So,
And
obviously, again, I know that you won't be able to comment fully until
we see the report. I mean, the work is ongoing. The field work is ongoing at the moment. Until we see that report, we can't really comment on.
No, but you're not
what
doing
it's gonna
nothing
do.
while you're waiting for the report, surely. I mean, the report's important, but you obviously, I hope, Police Scotland, the SPA, are doing something just now.
I think I'd leave
But
that to
the
the Chief
CCU.
Constable to comment on the actions that are taking place just now.
Well, I mean, yes, the review from the HMICS is critically important to us understanding whether those perceptions, whether those observations of the Federation have a basis. And I'm not saying whether they do or they don't, but I need to understand where the HMICS sees this issue. The Federation have not directly raised that matter with me yet. I'm sure they will subsequent to this meeting, to this committee meeting.
So you're not really, you're just waiting for this report and then you'll do something. I'm just trying to understand.
Well, this report, well, there are a range of issues that have been raised.
I know there are.
Well, I'm just trying to help the committee, forgive me. There are a range of issues that have been raised by IOCO, by a broader view about the proportionality of how counter-corruption units nationally and locally operate. This review will give us the basis to understand what is actually going on. And I will respond to that review. We've got, this is what is happening. They are looking at the culture and the practice and the approach of the counter-corruption unit. If that independent review raises issues that support this description, then we'll act.
What will be your timeline, do you think, for... What's our timeline? Sorry. I mean, once you get this review, what's your timeline and aspirational timeline, if you like, in terms of the actions you're going to take thereafter?
Well, it depends what the recommendations are, very clearly. I mean, if they deliver this in the spring, and I've got no reason to suggest that they won't, there could be a range of recommendations from, there needs to be a fundamental rethink in terms of the approach to actually this is in reasonable shape, and between those two parameters lie a set of decisions. So if it required a fundamental shift in our approach or our response to these issues, well, that will take longer. So it's very difficult until we see the recommendations to understand what the response needs to look like. But we will move. I will move as quickly as I can.
Will you involve the various professional bodies in this as well? Engage with them once this review is published? The likes of the SPF and so on.
Well, I mean, yes. I need to understand what it's very difficult to speculate on what on a report.
In principle, you'll be engaging with...
My in-principle position is always to engage with staff associations and the unions. That's my rebuttable presumption, because that's good leadership, that's good management. And these issues around communication, if we don't have federations, staff associations, other representative bodies helping us shape and make the right decisions, they're unlikely to be the best decisions that could be made. So subject to the view that there may be some technical issues here that are out with the Federation purview, what I would want is the Federation, staff associations and the unions to have confidence in our response. That's the position that I want to get to, and that will involve, of course, consulting with them.
Because I recollect the SPF don't have. I mean, they took the line and the view that the counter-corruption unit was, I'll put it in a law unto itself. It sort of just operated to a limb and nobody really knew what it was doing. And that didn't, putting it in blunt terms,
I don't agree with that characterisation.
No, but it was their position.
Yeah.
Mr Flanagan, what's the role of the SPA in all this when this report comes out? What's your remit? Do you have one here?
Yes,
Okay.
it's the SPA that has commissioned the HMICS to do the review, and the report will come to us, and then we will have a position to work on the recommendations, with coming with an action plan on Police Scotland to address the recommendations within an appropriate timescale. So yes, we have a central role in terms of the outcome of this review.
Sorry, is somebody else coming in this? Are you finished? John, are you in this subject? Is this you? You're down on my list.
Full stop.
You are. Off you go. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, gentlemen. Firstly, well done on the review, Chief Constable. I think that's welcome that systems have been looked at. It's a question, first and foremost, for the Police Authority. We know the new system's changed in the 2nd of March, and your report's published in June 2015, so presumably that was a report about the previous system.
Can I leave Mr Foley to answer that one, since I wasn't there at the time?
No, that was actually a report on the current system at that point in time, so the processes had changed on the 2nd of March and they were carrying out the review post that, so it was on the new system.
But there can't have been much time to gain an understanding with the experience of the new system in that turnaround, Mr Foley.
Well, so, some of it was in relation to the actual operation of the new system, and some of it was a review of the documentation which had been produced as well. So the new documentation came into effect on the 2nd of March also, so there was a review carried out in relation to that.
Okay. Right. And in relation to that, the report concluded that increased effectiveness of Police Scotland SPA whistleblowing process within the wider CCU unit should be significant for increasing awareness for officers and staff. So, key to the progress of whistleblowing or officers having confidence is the role of the CCU as far as the authority is concerned.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I wonder, in relation to that, Chief Constable, people might be surprised, and I know you're inheriting a situation that when you're the gentleman who acts prior to your appointment, who is also the disciplinary authority, is aware of these serious accusations made by the Scottish Police Federation, that you will await the outcome of a third party's report before acting. Do you know if Mr Richardson initiated anything on the basis of the comments made by the Federation that the CCU had scant regard for rules of fairness or proportionality, which, after all, they're supposed to be the custodians of ensuring?
I don't specifically know the answer to that question. What I would say is, in terms of what I think the question you're asking me is, and forgive me if I'm getting this wrong, is we need to review and understand whether there is anything in these allegations being made. Allegations is a strong word. I don't mean it in that sense. In these issues that the Federation are raising with us, the way to do that is to get an independent review of the operation of the counter-corruption unit, and that is what the HMICS is doing, and that's what I need to understand as a response to it. That is the appropriate body to provide us with the information to understand whether we need to amend our approach, and in what way.
No, I am commending the role of an independent body, but you don't see any, if you like, line management issues connected with that pending the publication of a report, which, after all, might mean that malpractice has continued for several months prior to the publication of the report?
I've seen no evidence or information to suggest to me that there's malpractice occurring. I will take a view when I get the report in terms of whether there are any line management issues.
Okay. And so, did the Police Scotland have a say in the terms of reference of the Inspectorate report into this?
We were asked to well, the answer to that is yes. I think in my first week here, I was provided with a copy of the terms of reference by Mr Penman, and I had no comment to make. They looked fit for purpose from my point of view.
Okay. And Mr Flanagan, is it unlikely authority will revisit the situation? My colleague Elaine Murray talked about again, a high-profile instance where an officer expressed concerns about, a senior officer expressed concerns. This was known to chief officers in Police Scotland. Police Authority wouldn't be visiting that again prior to the publication of this report?
If there was a specific complaint raised with us, then yes, we would. But at this stage, I'm not aware of one.
See, the challenge is for elected representatives is that we do have regular contact with police officers who are constituents, and they know, quite appropriately in many instances, that action is taken on fairly flimsy evidence. If when any report, allegation or complaint that may reasonably inferred as the terms, a report must go to the fiscal. But here we have very high-profile public hearing, if you like, where these serious accusations are made, and we're to understand that we've just to wait several months before the people who the public might look to, namely the authority and the chief officer, act on them.
Yes, if I could try and respond to that. If there is a specific allegation that the Federation, on behalf of a member, wants to make to me, then I will act on it. Of course I will. And I will take a view about whether it's appropriate, depending on what the nature of the complaint is and who is being complained about, as to whether that is appropriately investigated by our Professional Standards Department, the CCU, PERC, or an external third party. There are a range of responses to that. As I sit here, I have not had that formal complaint from the Federation or in terms of a specific set of allegations. If they had those concerns, then I would ask them to come to me and raise them with me. The more general issue, which, as described by other members of the committee, of an organisation within an organisation that's setting its own rules, I have seen nothing to support that broad characterisation, and that is the issue that the HMICS will take a view on in terms of the operating context and the way in which the CCU discharges its duty. But if the Federation or members of the Federation have specific complaints to make against officers of any rank in any part of the organisation, then they need to make them to me, and I will deal with it.
Okay. And in relation to the CCU, do you think long-term they're the appropriate recipients of complaints from officers? What's the role, for instance, connected with HR or the Professional Standards Department?
Well, I think in organisational life there are a range of issues, from people who are unhappy or don't understand what they're being asked to do, individual issues around grievance, so tensions between line managers and staff, which don't fall into conduct or discipline matters. So it depends where on that spectrum of organisational issue you are. So there is just good line management. There are grievance issues. There is then whistleblowing, which is more about concerns, not about an individual's treatment, but a practice or a custom or a response that is regarded to be not in the public interest by the person raising that, through to conduct in terms of professional standards, through to high-end corruption. And let's be clear, there is not a police service in the UK that doesn't need to have a very robust response to corruption. It's a live issue in every law enforcement agency. So we do need, but what we need is a proportionate response. We shouldn't be launching CCU investigations against inappropriate pieces of behaviour any more than we should attempt to be dealing with serious corruption through a sort of informal line management conversation. It is about understanding what's the nature of the complaint, what's the position of the complainant in terms of their potential vulnerability in the organisation, what do they need supportively wrapped around them as they go through a process, be it a grievance, a conduct matter, or a corruption allegation. So to answer your question in a sort of a slightly rambling way, I think it's absolutely determined by the nature of the allegation.
I think people would understand clear procedures would apply in criminal matters and in misconduct matters. I think the issue is matters out with that. Would you confirm that a police officer who is the subject of the attention of the CCU can only be a witness, a suspect, and an accused? They can't have any other status.
I suppose instinctively that sounds right, yes. Okay. Well, witness, suspect, accused, or complainant, actually. Well, they could be the complainant. Sorry, I'm just trying to think it through.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Follow up on this business of cases referred to the Crown, because, again, it may be anecdotal, but certainly passing through my inbox, cases where officers have been reported to the Crown and they have waited a considerable period of time to know whether or not they are going to be prosecuted. I would like to know the figures for that, because at the end of the day, how long, because they're suspended in no man's land, or he or she's suspended in no man's land, there's a cloud hanging over them, they're given paper jobs to do or something at work. I'd like to know the length of time and how many actually proceed to a criminal prosecution, because there is a whiff sometimes. I know no more than this is simply recounting what I am told, a whiff that this is being used in a vengeful way sometimes by somebody whose face doesn't fit. And they might then be referred to the Crown and, you know, lives fall apart and everything like that, and nothing happens at the end of all that. Now, I just put that to you because probably you are aware of all this already. I'd like to know the statistics and how many of these, how long it takes for the Crown to decide, well, not to prosecute, let's take those 29 cases, and how many prosecutions then follow.
I'm very happy to provide that to the committee. I don't have those figures with me, but I share your concern around the impact on officers of being, and actually on the public purse and on the service we should provide to the public, of having officers either restricted or suspended for very long periods. You know, I've seen that throughout my career, how damaging that can be for officers who are ultimately, some of whom have not actually been found to have committed the offences that they've been accused of. There is a range of issues here. I'll happily get the figures for you in terms of
that underlying thing, which may not always be the case, but sometimes may be the case, that it's a form of revenge.
Well, I would be very concerned about that. You know, that's a very serious matter.
It is indeed.
And I will take that seriously. There is a broad issue around public confidence in terms of how effectively the police deal with its own when complaints are made. So I have seen this from the other perspective as well, where there is a complete absence, a lack of confidence in the public that when allegations of misbehaviour, either internally or externally by police officers made, that they are not robustly and appropriately dealt with. So there is a balance here to be struck between public confidence and treating staff fairly.
Absolutely appreciate the balance and perception. Margaret, you've come in because you've not been in yet. Do you want to come in?
Thank you, Convener. It's really on the general communication within the police. In the staff survey, which we had the report of in September last year, the particular issues were raised around internal engagement, including heavy reliance on cascading information by email and through the intranet, where personal methods such as through the line management or team shift briefings were preferred. So what's been done to address that then? Has things changed since September?
Things are in the process of changing, and I recognise the issues coming out of the staff survey. Since that survey was delivered to us, and I take no responsibility for this, this is those that went before, there have been 43 Chief Officer-led staff engagement exercises to understand what are the issues that sit underneath the staff survey. So that's been a significant effort on behalf of the organisation to follow up and really understand what sits beneath those high-level headlines. Again, just as part of my own personal learning as I embed myself in Police Scotland, I've done 7 personal staff engagements where actually I've just wanted to understand, how does it feel from your point of view? What is it that we need to do? You know, actually what I've found is a staff that are hugely motivated, passionate and delivering brilliant service day and night for the people of Scotland. So, you know, it's an enormously humbling to see the quality of staff that we have and are joining this organisation. They're doing fantastic work. In terms of what that then adds up to, there are 4 broad themes that come out of those workshops. Firstly, improving leadership, and that's across the whole of the organisation. On some levels, it is probably understandable when you're bringing that number of organisations together at that speed, with that level of grit required, that there may be an over-reliance on email. I think we're now at the position where we need to understand what is good leadership, and that is about listening and talking to people and recognising where information is best provided through email, and you know, transactionally that will have to be the way in a national organisation where the visibility of senior leaders will always be a challenge. But we need to support leadership at every level in the organisation, so that our leaders are confident and we provide them with the sorts of information they need in order to brief their staff, and that we also have a conduit back so we can understand and hear what they're saying. There is a second issue around engaging and valuing each other. So for me, that touches on our approach to performance. How do we spot people doing things right? What are our reward and recognition processes? How do we celebrate great work? And what are the sorts of things that we say are important to enable staff to deliver on their sense of vocation and deliver their professional judgment? Third piece is around our voice, which is about them being heard. And it goes back to probably where we started. At its most serious end, it is about them being able to, with confidence, to escalate issues that are causing them concern around conscience or conduct. But more importantly, it's about how do we make sure they're part of designing this service. What I've seen is staff who are massively committed. And as we go on the next stage of the evolution of Police Scotland, it's landed. We now need to transform it. We now need to understand, within the limits of what you can do in a 23,000 person organisation, to really understand how staff can, because they know the answers to the problems, particularly in local communities. I will not, from Stirling. And the other fourth element is what they've described as exciting experience, which is actually, this is a brilliant job to be in. And actually it provides enormous opportunities to make the difference to people's lives in the community when it really matters. And it's about enabling them to deliver on that set of excitement. So we are now at the process where we've gone through 43 workshops. I've done some triangulation personally since I've been here. We've got 4 broiled areas of work, and we're developing, we keep coming back to action plans, but we're going to develop approaches around all of those areas that I think will move Police Scotland on in terms of the staff survey. And actually it's about just being a bit humane, having a degree of humility, about being prepared to listen and recognise you may not have got it completely right, enabling staff to be prepared to make mistakes within parameters, encouraging them to innovate, deliver locally in a way that makes best sense to them and their people. That's the organisation we need to move from. One from which is heavily reliant on compliance, through to one where actually the ambition is around discretionary effort, where people know the values of the organisation and they're able to respond and deliver.
So would you say there has been a reduction in the number of emails that are sent to officers since the survey?
I don't know, is the short answer. Kavina, I wouldn't dream of trying to bamboozle you. I'm too old and hoary to do that. The simple answer is I don't know. In terms of the numbers of emails.
There is a preference for, the one to...
I don't have a preference for email.
The preference for briefings.
Yeah. Well, yes, there is, absolutely. And one of the things that we are doing is strengthening our internal communications department, because actually we need to provide staff, supervisors, leaders, with good briefing material. Actually, there should be a set of core messages or issues that on a monthly basis we are able to distill out and say to, in accessible, plain English, these are the issues that your individual guys and girls need to know about. And actually, we need to hear back from you what those issues are. We need to embark on, it's very easy for me, isn't it, to come in and do this, but actually the visibility of the Chief Officer team, how we develop an ongoing programme of staff engagement whereby we're not responding on the back of an unhelpful or difficult survey. It becomes how we lead the organisation in terms of our own visibility. Now, we are a relatively small Chief Officer team in a 23,000 person organisation. There's a responsibility for everybody who stepped forward into a leadership role from sergeant through. Now, the higher up you are, the bigger the responsibility. But we need to move away from a transactional, email-driven organisation, if that's where we are, to one where what I have just described in an attempt to bamboozle you, convener, is where I would wish us to be.
It was just delicious. It was a delicious moment. Admit it. After all that, you get so many emails.
I admired the way the ball was crossed and how you headed it home, Convener.
So I'll never forget that one, Margaret. That's going down in history. I'm afraid I can only take one more question. I'm sorry. No, I've got another member. I can tell you about this. This is the one and only chance of the members to ask questions, and we've got a stage 2 straight after this. The Cabinet Secretary's waiting. Very quickly.
I just wanted to follow through just briefly on it is brief, convener, from the staff survey, following on some of the questions that Margaret has put. Obviously, we've heard a lot about the steps you've been taking to try and improve that internal communication. In the staff survey, under the heading commitment, 33% of all respondents indicated an intention to leave for a whole variety of reasons, although, to be fair, it was suggested when asked the factors that were adversely affecting the commitment to the organisation, 49% said changes to pensions. But might care to remind me about when the next survey will be undertaken? And is it your view at the present time, after 2 months in the job, that morale is much better now than it was in September?
I will pitch. I mean, it would be a very brave Chief Constable who sat here 2 months in and said everything's fixed, morale is great. All I can give you is some anecdotes in the way you provided to me. As I've gone out and spoken to staff, I don't necessarily see the workforce reflected in that survey. I see passionate, committed individuals who want to make a difference. And in terms of the repetition,
could I deal with the specific of the question in terms of when we set out the first survey, we said that we would repeat it in 2 years' time, but that we would take a temperature check within 12 months. Temperature checks a more focused, narrow testing of opinions around the key issues that came out of the first one, and that would take place through the late summer of this year. And that is intended, in terms of our actions, you need to have completed some of the actions early enough so that when this temperature check comes back, you're actually beginning to see some reaction to the things that you've done to try to address these issues.
Thank you.
Stop the overrun. Can I thank you very much for attending? I apologise. No, I apologise to Mr. Finlay. I did warn that this session was there's no points of order in committee. I suspend now for 3 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Maybe you should come on time.